Bookseller Crow on the box. Tales from an empty bookshop.
Action.
Good evening and welcome to our latest talk from an empty bookshop. Tonight we welcome Lev Parikian.
Hello, John.
That's the thing I should have said. What? How do you pronounce your surname?
That's perfect. That's perfect. I've had all sorts. Yeah, as long as there's one K in it and the stress is on the Rick bit.
I just hoped it wasn't like Chumley and
no,
it's Parker.
Actually, it's
Lev's written a fabulous book actually, which explores both his love of nature and mainly the outside world, although there are some creepy crawlies inside as well, but also tells a lot of the history of the various enthusiastic people that have put into train a kind of I don't know, the landscape of and which also takes in the history of some very entertaining characters and organisations, of possibly something like 250 years of natural history.
Something like that, yeah, something like that. I was trying to find our way into the book. I had this idea to write a book about the way we are in nature. So a lot of them nature books are kind of looking at the nature, and the humans don't play a part in that. I thought it'd be quite nice just to incorporate us because we are part of it, and it's inseparable from it. And it's a very broad subject, so trying to find our way into it that would not just be a single thing of bloke goes out, looks at some nature. So I thought I'd do it not just my own journey as a kind of reformed nature lover, having been a very keen bird watcher as a kid and then lost the impetus for it as an adult, and then having come surging back as a middle-aged man. So this is a continuation of that journey that I told in my last book, Why Do Birds Suddenly Disappear? And broadening out from birds into other forms of nature, butterflies and spiders and everything, sort of fascination with it. And so there was that strand to it. The other strand is going out to see these spectacles and seeing how the people I meet were in it, or even just on my doorstep, people who might have been oblivious to it. But just to give it a bit of background, to see a little bit of the history of the experts, I suppose, people like Darwin and Gilbert White, who devoted their lives to it. So trying to cover as much of that spectrum of nature engagement, if you like, from the completely oblivious to the fully engaged and the expert, and to give a bit of historical background as well.
Would you like to read a bit?
Shall I read a bit? Yeah, I haven't. I could easily read the bit at the very beginning, but it's a bit long. But also this shortish passage I've chosen has two particularly relevant things. Firstly, it's about swifts, which are one of my favourite birds, which are just on their way out as we speak. Ours, we've got one or two left. I think they've got maybe fledglings just about to get going, but the others, we had about a dozen of them. I think they've gone back to Africa. They're a very short season they have. There's also relevant to your interests in Crystal Palace. There's a little bit about Crystal Palace Park in it. So this is so 7th of May 2019. I've been twitchy all week, hoping they might somehow come back a couple of days early, but knowing from previous years that they're not due yet. There's a nervousness too. What if they don't make it? Numbers countrywide are down. Something to do with weather systems in southern Europe, maybe. Something to do with a general decline in recent years. Something to do with ecological collapse. But ours will make it. They have to. They do. Some years they announce themselves with a scream and a flyby and an exuberance entirely out of keeping with the distance they've travelled. If I'd just flown in from Africa, I'd barely have the energy to dump my bags in the hall before flummoxing on the sofa for a week. But then I have the luxury of a freezer full of food and, should the need arise, a takeaway menu. The struggle for survival is rather more claw to beak for birds. This year, their arrival is more discreet, and I see them only because I'm looking for them, and I mean really looking, with the kind of attention that nearly gets me run over by an incredulous gesticulating cyclist as I cross the road at the bottom of the hill. And there they are, wriggling punctuation marks high over the house. Why swifts? Why not swallows, house martins, sand martins, nightingales, redstarts, chiffchaffs, willow warblers, whitethroats, blackcaps, and any one of the other birds that make a similar, equally hazardous journey every year? Well, they're all great too, obviously. But swifts have something about them. That sickle shape, their astonishing speed, the brevity of their stay in this country. All contributing to my blind, unrequited love for them, my desire to stand outside the back door looking gormlessly upwards, drinking in their every appearance. Perhaps it's their mastery of the air, the sheer audacity of their aerobatics, the impression they give with their high-pitched squeals that they're having enormous fun. They are, more even than kestrels and albatrosses and hummingbirds, the embodiment of flight. They fly the way I'd like to, if I had the ability, fast and free and screaming with the thrill of it all. Swifts abhor the ground to the extent that if they land on it, they need a helping hand to get up again. And when not sitting on eggs, they spend the majority of their lives in the air. Not like those lightweights, the swallows, with all their perching and whatnot. I started noting the date of the swift's return a few years ago, and it proved the beginning of what, for want of a better word, I call a nature diary. It's a haphazard, woefully inconsistent mishmash of notes and photos and question marks and incomplete lists that would horrify any true naturalist. But it is still, in its own way, a nature diary. From it, I know that on the 3rd of October 2015, I was excited by a blackbird singing from the top of next door's tree, that on the 14th of April 2018, I saw the first orange-tipped butterfly of the year in West Norwood Cemetery, and that every year for the last 6 years, the swifts have arrived on either the 6th or the 7th of May. They're nothing if not consistent. From it, I also know that I have a tendency to forget about my nature diary for about 3 months every July. 'Twas ever thus. Sometimes my entries comprise nothing more than a list of birds seen, a dull, efficient way of keeping records, but sadly lacking in the fond memories department. Sometimes the shortest of notes evokes a particular image, and I can remember the occasion clearly. Blue tit on bathroom ledge, or, even more memorably, magpie in kitchen. And when I read the words buggy mummies, swans, I remember the warm day in March 2017, when, while admiring 2 mute swans preparing their pitch for the season's nest in Crystal Palace Park, I heard a young mother say to her friend, "Oh, look, the swans are making a nest. I suppose they'll be laying eggs soon. Do swans lay eggs? I should know this." These records play their part in the gradual accrual of familiarity with my patch, but my efforts to get to know it have been earnest and sincere, and if I'm beginning to recognise subtleties, changes and patterns, can tell you which birds are most likely to be found doing what and where and when, and if I've started to identify butterflies, trees, flowers, and even the occasional bee, then these efforts can only be considered paltry when placed alongside the man whose observations of his patch led to him being known as the father of ecology. And if you want to know who the father of ecology was, you'll have to buy the book. It was Gilbert White.
We had we had our own magpie in the kitchen recently. Eating the cat's food.
Oh, for God's sake! Was the cat just looking on, silently or out of the room?
No, and Justine made a film of it, but then when we looked at it back, it was great, except there were a couple of cat food tins on the floor, which didn't, wasn't very Instagram friendly.
We've had, you have to be careful what you put on Instagram. But anything of kind of any dead birds, and people just go, "Oh, what do you think?" No, the magpie was memorable. We didn't actually realise it was there. It was on. We've got one of those pulley laundry dryer things.
Right.
And
yeah.
Tess was just getting it down, and realised just suddenly this from above. And it was very calm, actually. It kind of stayed there. And I opened up the doors and then got up on the ladder. And the moment I approached it, it was off. I think it was a juvenile. It was a couple of summers ago.
I mean, you talk about your patch.
Yeah.
And as I understand it, every kind of birder has their area. What I loved about your patch is that it's very South London, South East London.
Yeah.
In fact.
And that's where I live, so you know.
But it's a really nice the way the book starts with that kind of your very local thing, and then gradually
just expanding out,
expands out. Yeah.
Well, that was again the plan. I think that was my original idea was to make it a sort of spiral. And then I added in the idea of visiting these places associated with the great naturalists. So it wasn't just a kind of random journey, that it did have these stepping stones that gave it some sort of shape. But I thought, talking about the way it starts, lying down on the pavement looking at a butterfly, I thought it was also very important to encompass everything. So not just the grand spectacles, but the stuff that we can find in our houses, whether we like it or not, whether it's a magpie or a spider in the sink, but also just in the most mundane places. And South East London's as mundane as anywhere else.
But then the first place that you go to, you say in the book you could have walked to.
Yeah. It would have been a bit of a long walk, but
and I was reading that passage, and I thinking about when you did walk from Beckenham, out to Down House. And I've been out there a few times, and I know they're almost like Devon kind of roads, aren't they?
I mean, it's big hedges, and I really nearly did get run over by a Tesco van or an Audi. But that was interesting. I mean, I kind of wanted to walk the whole way. This is out to Down House Down in Kent, which is, it's Biggin Hill airfield. And it's not that far, and I'm a very keen walker, except when my back's playing up. And it would have been a decent morning's walk, getting there for sort of lunchtime, but I didn't really have the time to do it. So I took the train to Beckenham and then walked the rest. But part of that was to do with that transition from the urban to the rural.
And which is really noticeable when you go.
Yeah, it really is. And then you find yourself, okay, so I'm in the rural bit, but I'm also on what actually is a main road. And so on the one hand, you notice how little that part of the world has changed since Darwin's time, but then also you really notice big time the differences in the way people treat the countryside, just driving through it without a glance to the left or the right.
And then gradually your adventures get longer and more elaborate. In a way,
they do. Well, of course, the further away you go, you have to. The longer you have to stay somewhere. So a day trip to Gilbert White's house in Selborne is perfectly doable. I wanted to get there very early, so I left at kind of 3 a.m. on an autumn day, and got there for dawn, and met possibly the grumpiest dog walker I've ever met, which was interesting. And where else? I went to John Clare, of course, the peasant poet. I was also really interested in the way these great figures had expressed their love of nature. So with Darwin, we've got somebody who unravelled its mysteries, unlike anybody before. Gilbert White, who was the patch master, spent his life looking and observing one local patch, and he did leave it, but really his attentions were only in Selborne and the things he observed there. John Clare, who was so closely bound with his own love of nature and his own area, which changed irrevocably in his lifetime from his youth, when he would have had free rein to roam everywhere, and then the Enclosure Acts made everything partitioned and compartmentalised in a way that really had a terrible, profound effect on him. But also the fact that he wrote about it and he expressed his love of it in poetry. And then the next step was to Thomas Bewick up in Northumberland, who expressed his love of it with his engravings and illustrations, and so on. So the more the merrier. But gave that little journey to it.
I was very taken by the fact that each of these characters have really fascinating and wide biographies, particularly the people like Peter Scott.
Yeah.
What an amazing life.
Extraordinary life. I mean, God, I list it, don't I? And I can't remember exactly what it is, but it's just, he did everything. He was an Olympic skating medalist, he was a gliding champion, he was a conservationist, he was a writer, and he founded the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust. So, and he was a painter as well. He was a really good painter too. Yeah. How could I forget?
But I did wonder if you didn't see a little bit of yourself reflected in that as well, given that your other job is as a
it's a day job. If anybody doesn't know this, most people wouldn't. Is an orchestra conductor. So I've spent my life, most of my life, in music, except for the last 3 months when I haven't had any, tiny violin, no work at all. So as an orchestra conductor, there's a kind of different discipline to writing, because you're standing up in front of a load of people and having to give it out there, and with writing it's a much more introverted thing. Yes, but possibly that might have been a sort of unconscious parallel. I suppose I was just fascinated by people who that mixture of some people who are very single-minded and pursue one thing. I mean, there are other examples I could have chosen of people who have spent their lives studying a single species of dragonfly kind of thing. And then something like Scott, whose upbringing, of course, was that upper class, turn of the 20th century upper class thing of just getting out there and doing things. Adventure. His father being Royal Fulton Scott of the Antarctic. And just being incredibly outdoorsy and incredibly proficient and incredibly kind of interested in lots of different stuff, which I think is a kind of unfashionable, has been an unfashionable thing for some years now, isn't it? People kind of specialise in things. So I was interested in that, but also for him, and with Gavin Maxwell as well, who I've also featured. Just an excuse to go to Skye, really. The transition from shooting birds to conserving them.
Sure.
And again, that was being a product of his upbringing. It was the most natural thing in the world when he went up to Cambridge to go out hunting and shooting, and just that was the way he was in the countryside, and thought nothing of it. But then through his life, he really changed his mind and wrote about it as well, saying I would have a word with my self of 30 years ago and say, what are you doing? Yeah.
Justine, have you got a question?
Yes, I do, as it
Hello,
goes.
Justine.
Hi, Lev.
Hello.
My first question, or
Ooh.
possibly my only chance to have a question, but I'll lob this one in. Completely at a different tangent.
Yeah.
Birdfulness. Explain.
Oh, birdfulness. Well, actually, that's the bit I was going to read, but I'll
marvellous. In that case, I'll ask a different question.
Do a different one. Let's got that.
Okay.
But I can do. I will talk about birdfulness if you want. But that is literally the passage I was going to finish with.
Oh,
I should have said sorry.
It was a good one. All right, I've got a serious one now.
Okay. Oh no, I hate the serious ones.
Okay, but
The serious answer.
In the story of the urban encounter with a hard-looking bloke, an even harder-looking dog that results in an engagement about the nature around, whereas at Selborne, as you mentioned, another encounter with the world's most miserable dog walker was really rather sad and an aloof and empty experience. I realise your observations of humans, like the jogger, are as canny as the wildlife portraits. The guy with the recalcitrant tripod in the hide, which really made me laugh.
Poor guy.
With his massive lens in the wetland centre, and also Miss Yoo-hoo Eagle on Skye. They're brilliant. But my favourite was on page 140. The old man labouring against the flow of school children in a corridor at Tring, like a salmon working its way upstream. What do you find most interesting? Human or non-human natural history?
Oh, that's it. That's a good serious question, and there's no definitive answer. I find them both fascinating. There's so many aspects of that. Monsieur Who, by the way, was an absolute gift, because we went on this boat trip to see the white-tailed eagles. And I've been, in writing this book, you always want to try and find stories, and you want to try and hang various episodes on things. And I thought if we saw eagles, then that's fantastic. And from the moment we got on the boat, I just thought, I can't get the notebook out, but I've got to remember everything she says, because she was like, if you've seen Detectorists, she was like Maggie, Lance's ex-wife. She was completely over the top. She was there, as I say in the book. She was there, which is the main thing. A lot of people aren't there. She was interested, but she was funny, and I had to not catch my son, especially my son's eye, to just giggles, because and then afterwards we got off the boat and he said, "Oh, she was Maggie, wasn't she?" So she's, but I think that was one thing that was handed to us on a plate, really. But I am always looking. I was fascinated by this because when I was writing Why Do Birds Suddenly Disappear, I noticed that the people who were observing the nature were as interesting as the nature itself. And I think that ties in with my big thing, my big hobby horse, which is that we are part of nature, and that separation is not healthy. And I think it's one of the reasons why we are one of the more nature-depleted countries in the world, that we are having real ecological crisis. And I didn't want to make a heavy thing of that, because I think other people, are more knowledgeable people than me, are doing serious books about that and doing it far better than I could. But I didn't want to ignore it as well. You can't ignore it completely. So it's just an interesting aspect of the whole experience. So I think the answer to your question, Justine, is that I find them both equally interesting, and that they're inextricable. You can't separate one from the other. So those illustrations that you chose, I think were good examples of that.
A year ago, we were in Brooklyn. We were in Prospect Park. Well, it was more than a year ago, because it was Good Friday, and we came across this group of people looking up into a tree, and one of them was this Rasta with dreads right down his back, and he had an old kind of a steel racing bike, and a camera with a lens about that long on it, and there was an Asian woman with him and a couple of other people, and we went up and said, what are you looking at? And he said, it's a long-eared owl. He said, first time in 20 years that there's been a long-eared owl in the park. He said, last year they said they had one in Central Park, but nobody saw it.
Nobody saw it. It's difficult to see long-eared owls. I'd say they do. Well, their camouflage is amazing.
They lent me binoculars. We had a good luck.
Good luck, yeah. But when they're roosting in the daytime, there's not. I did spend about an hour once down in Dungeness RSPB looking at the bushes, knowing that there was an owl in there because somebody had told me that it was there and it was daytime and it wasn't moving anywhere. And I just couldn't see it. But then when you've seen it, like Where's Wally, you know exactly which leaf it looks exactly like. But there was something else I was going to say. Oh yes, the thing about what I find interesting. Is illustrated in the very beginning of the book, which is, I'll briefly talk about it. The reason I was lying on a pavement outside my home is that I'd seen a butterfly come and fly in onto a plant on the pavement, in a very kind of bog standard corner of West Norwood, South East London. And it was low down, so I wanted to get down and get close to it. And there was a small girl, about 4 or 5 years old, who was running up the pavement towards me, and she kind of stopped a couple of yards away and looked at me, as you would when there's a middle-aged man lying on the pavement. And behind her was her father, who was head in foam, completely oblivious to everything, which I think we've all kind of done. We've all done that. But I think that was the interesting thing for me there was that there were the three points on the spectrum, his complete indifference and lack of awareness of anything at all natural, not even wondering why is that guy. I think he probably maybe saw his daughter near this weird guy and just thought, get her out of there. My extreme enthusiasm, and this girl who was probably curious to see what I was looking at and might have seen the butterfly and gone, oh, that's beautiful, and looked for the next one. But I think I do find it fascinating how we can wander around and not be aware of it. And I had this conversation with somebody in an interview the other day, and they said, what about swifts? And I said, yeah, they're amazing, aren't they? He said, how can you not notice them? They scream around at head height. How can you not notice them? People just go, whoa. So I find it interesting, and I get a bit evangelical about it now that there's nothing more zealous than the recent convert, and I did spend a lot of my life not being that engaged. So now I am. I want to grab people and go, look at this. Yeah, it's a long-eared owl. It's a swift. It's a butterfly. It's a spider.
It's a lizard.
Yeah, it's a lizard. Yeah, again, lying down on the stomach looking for a lizard. Yeah. So I do spend a lot of time lying down in this book.
Yeah, you do quite a bit. Yeah, it's. Do you want to ask another one?
Well, just sort of going on further from that. Because you absolutely nail the spirit of needing to share nature even with complete strangers. I did it recently on Hames Lane. I heard a goldfinch singing, and I wanted to tell everybody it was a goldfinch.
But they're so cheery, aren't they?
They are so cheery.
And also, from my point of view, I don't know. I mean, I've now reached. I'm in my mid-50s, and I've now kind of reached the age where I don't care. You think, okay, they're going to think I'm an idiot, but so, they would have. Probably anyway, so you're just going to go.
But how your book also continually mentions the contradictory, pleasing absence of humans, the kind of desire also for solitude. How do you reconcile the two?
I think that is partly to do with sometimes it's my mood. Sometimes I just feel like I want to be alone, and it gives me that kind of headspace. And then there are other people, it depends on the people as well. I mean, I know with last time I was here, I did an event with David Darrell Lambert, who's a fantastic ornithologist and enthusiast, and I'll go anywhere with him because we're friends and we don't know each other that well, but we've been out often enough to know that we kind of gel. But when you're with somebody who's not on the same wavelength, and I think it's true of kind of any situation, sometimes you're up for a good social night out in the pub. Wouldn't that be great? With mates, and sometimes you just want to sit in the corner in the pub, but reading your book or just not engaging. And it depends on mood, depends on the people, and it depends on just the particular vibe at that time. And I think it's the same with nature. So sometimes I want to just have that moment by myself, and other times I want to share it with other people forcibly.
You're writing another?
Just so happens I am writing another book, yeah. So this is the book I'm writing at the moment. It's going to be, well, the original title is 72 Seasons. And it's based on the traditional ancient Japanese calendar. So we have 4 seasons: spring, summer, autumn, and winter. This Japanese calendar, which is also in its turn, I think, has evolved from some Chinese folkloric things, divides the year into much smaller little chunks. Each one about 5 or 6 days long, and each one with its own name based on what might be expected to, happen in that little period of the year. So bush warblers start singing, or geese start flying north, or that kind of thing. So I'd heard about this concept a few years ago, and read a very little bit about it, and thought that it was an interesting thing, and started thinking, how do we divide things up? Because we all know the difference between the beginning of spring and that moment where it goes from spring into summer, so you're end of May or beginning of May, say, and it's quite difficult to say where. I know the calendar says where they begin, but actually there's all sorts of elements that that blend through, and it's all a cyclical thing. So I had this idea to write a book, which is going to be 72 short pieces of writing, each one based on my observations of my local patch again. So West Norwood, my garden, West Norwood Cemetery, Streatham Common, that kind of thing. So that will be, I'm writing it at the moment, and it'll be out at the end of autumn next year. So,
do you ever venture as far as South Norwood Park?
I have been to South Norwood Country Park. It's brilliant, lovely. I have only been there once this year, but when I can actually get myself galvanised to move further than West Norwood, then I do. I mean, I go elsewhere, but that's really good, and it's very well managed for all sorts of wildlife. It's great. It's amazing. London's amazing, really. There's so many green spaces. So you can. I mean, I think if you're in the very inner cities, it's difficult. But there is always something to be found. There's always going to be a tiny green space somewhere. So everybody needs to be aware of this. I think if I'm going to get evangelical about one thing, then that's it's democratic, it's free, and it's all around us.
We went down there. We often go down there because it's close to us. But we went down there recently because at the start of these films, there's a couple of crow caws.
Yeah.
And Justine had the mad idea that we were going to record them live, and we got the parents swearing at their kids.
Of course. Part of the nature experience, isn't it?
Which brings to mind John's point, actually, that his most favourite bit about your book.
Is it the sweary bit, John?
It's the sweary bits.
The funny thing is, this happened in around after the first edit. You send these things off, and they come back with general comments. Okay, this is great, love it. And we'd got through the first structural bit and the copy edit, and I just sent a note to Pippa, who was supervising it. I just said, "Is it too sweary?" Because there is, without giving you a spoiler, there is one bit where 4 out of the 5 words are based on fuck. So, and she said, "I didn't notice." Really? Because I swear quite a lot in my books, and I feel like I do. But you're trying to reach a wide audience, and you don't want to scare the horses, as it were. But so apparently that's fine. But I like a good swear, don't you? I think it's important.
Well, particularly if you've been bitten by a dog.
Yeah, that was unbelievable. That was.
Anyway, birdfulness.
Birdfulness.
Shall we finish with birdfulness?
Birdfulness, explain.
Right, so birdfulness is, we all know about mindfulness, which has been the thing for the last few years, and a very useful thing, I think, for people's mental health. It is. And it just occurred to me that there are various different ways of achieving this. So perhaps I'll read I'll just read the passage about that very concept, and which will explain it rather better than I can. So I've visited. This is on a visit to one of my favourite places in London, which is the Wetland Centre in Barnes, which is the London wing of the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust. So this is to do with Peter Scott, who we were talking about. And I'm in there, in contemplative mode. I've had many pleasant encounters in wildlife hides. Temporary friendships have been forged, information shared. I've learnt a lot. But sometimes all you want is solitude. And in that solitude, when all the elements are in alignment, a fine thing can happen. I don't have a single word for it, but in my head it is this. The particular calmness engendered by sitting alone in a bird hide, looking out on an expanse of water on which nothing particular is happening, but everything is happening. The fossicking of a snipe, the dabbling of a shoveler, the flitting of a loose group of starlings, the serene floating of a pintail, whatever it happens to be on that occasion. And not focusing on one element in particular, but letting the entirety of the scene wash over you and seep into your consciousness until the mind, at first so active and distracted, is becalmed, and your breathing slows, and soon the nothing of it becomes everything, and you slough off the cares and worries of everyday life, and just for a bit, all is well. Sometimes you focus on the activity of a single bird, that little grebe, say, floating insouciantly, then diving with a little jump and coming up 30 seconds later, 20 yards to the left of where you thought it would. Or you regard it as a game of Where's Wally, scouring the mudflats for the jacksnipe someone saw earlier that morning. Or you just sit and allow the whole scene to wash over you, bathing in its peaceful glow. And sometimes, just occasionally, and only if you're in the right place, you might catch a glimpse of an otter, an actual wild otter, not the tame ones that come out at feeding time because they know which side their bread is buttered, but a wild one that has writhed and wriggled its way to the water's edge just to be with you. Or that's what it feels like anyway. Water is, I think, an important component of this particular piece of mind resting. Everything is 10% better by water. We can theorise as to why exactly this is, whether it taps into our own composition or whether it's to do with the calming influence of water's myriad rhythms and shapes, or any one of another 1,000 reasons or a combination of them all. But whatever the reasons, I regard it as fact. No doubt there's a word in German for this feeling engendered by this particular situation. You might call it mindfulness if you're so inclined. A specific kind of mindfulness. Birdfulness, maybe. It doesn't always work. It's all very well wafting round the countryside saying, "Hello birds, hello Skye," but we can't expect nature to make everything right just like that. And nor should we imagine it's a fail-safe. That places too much responsibility on it, too much pressure. Sometimes your mind isn't in that place. But today it is. 10 minutes into this visit, I have reached a state of 38% birdfulness. I wonder idly if the reported bittern is around. And now, as if conjured by the thought, it's there, morphed from the reeds themselves, treading gingerly on the ice, head forward, thick neck slung low. A most unbird-like bird in many ways, an awkward, streaky tube of strangeness, the product of a margin doodle. It gives me just 5 minutes before sloping back into the depths, 5 minutes of the deepest satisfaction, during which I imagine Peter Scott's delight that his fantasy project has yielded such riches. Birdfulness level, 100%. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lev.
Giving applause to the bittern.
Brilliant, thank you.